And streaming.
Scrutiny because I can see the text.
Yes.
pretty
You want me
quickly
to
on
show
my
my
desk.
screen?
Yeah, please do.
Well, it's not going to be live because it's private, so I'd have to go downstairs.
Yeah, well, it's fine. It'll be streaming, it'll show up. So, there is a microphone on the table. It will probably pick all of us up because we're here, we're fairly close. It'll be
Okay.
fine. We have these if we have more people walk in, but I think we're probably okay. Feel free to come closer if you'd like. So I am going to open the meeting at 7:18. We were attempting to wait for a quorum, which we did not get. There are 3 of us, which constitutes half of the membership of the subcommittee, and a typical quorum is the majority of the subcommittee. So we will not be transacting business. However, we can legally meet and continue with the meeting. The main purpose of today's meeting is to discuss with Rick Vanderpool, our environmental expert, his findings from the walk and his report that he has given to us. And so with that, let me double check my agenda. We would normally look at meeting minutes, which we can't do here. But yes, general business would be, Rick is our first item. Our next one, which is after that, will be to set the next meeting. Now, we don't have a quorum, but that is not anything other than planning, so we can do that as well. And that will pretty much sum up the meeting. We will have public comment just like we normally would. But again, we would not be able to act on anything specifically. We do have a guest here with us as well. Chris is the new chair of the Conservation Commission. And so with that, Rick, the show is yours.
Okay, thanks very much, Dave. Appreciate it.
Actually, you know what I am going to do, just because you're slightly more soft-spoken than I am, I'm going to aim that slightly at you and turn it on.
Little does Dave know my professorial voice.
I know.
Yeah, he'll learn at some point. In any case, great to be here. Thanks for inviting me to report out on our May walk, May 25th walk on the site. As many of you know, I have been working as an environmental consultant for about 40 years and have worked on a number of different energy projects. Northern Pass was one of the more recent ones. I have also worked on a lot of different solar farms, 5 in Vermont. I'm also on retainer I'm working for Tin Mountain. I'm their research director, and in that sort of job description, they're having me work with Olive Wood for that project, which is 110 megawatts as planned, roughly 400 acres of clearing. So it doesn't dwarf this project, but it's considerably larger, I think about 50% larger. Wow. So I have been brought into sort of the Olive Wood solar development review path for a while now, a couple of years. And having worked in Vermont since 2012, I think was the first panel array that I worked on. The primary sort of goal of my work is to advise municipalities, interest groups, private citizens, abutters, what have you, about what the potential consequences are going forward over the long term. The long term in most solar leases tends to be 35 to 40 years. There was one that I worked on that was spec'd out for 50 years. So they're not perhaps even as long-term as, say, a hydro project where a dam being built in 1850 is still in operation. It's just being upgraded from time to time. These fields, in terms of the term limit, is significant not just because of the potential disposition of the property once the the facility has been terminated or shut down. But unlike Vermont Yankee and some of the others that we've decommissioned in terms of nuclear facilities, they can be dismantled very quickly, and the land can be very quickly returned to some state of long-term, hopefully conservation on Everwood. That's some of the requests that we have made with Olivewood, and I would make the same request as from the town of Webster, is that if these leases have term limits, as they are proposed to do, and you look at the longer-term disposition of the land, instead of having sort of a carte blanche potential of further development of either energy infrastructure or residential subdivisions or what have you, including some type of long-term conservation of at least a portion of the critical parts of the land, especially that associated with the impacts, like wetland impacts, stream crossing impact, is an advisable or suggested recommendation for a memorandum of understanding with Olivewood in this particular case before they off it to next era energy.
Yeah, sorry, I don't know whether you want questions before, during, or after. But
let me run through a couple more points and I'll frame it, and then I'll let you know if that's okay. So getting back to why that's important, looking at the length of the impact, the term limit of the impact is a part of what makes acceptable mitigation acceptable, right? So for instance, there's one crossing of Deer Meadow Brook, I believe is the name of the, I see two names, but Deer Meadow is what I believe we talked about in the field. And that crossing, if properly constructed to state standards under Chapter 900 of the wetland rules, will be there for a lot longer than 40 years. It'll be there for hopefully 100 years, unless there's some flood event or some unusual thing that would take it out. So that, in other words, you have to look at the term limit of the impact as well as the term limit of the mitigation that takes place according to the requirements of the impact. And that's why in something like that, as we discussed in the field, looking at the even longer term than the lease agreement for the land is advisable for any of the impacts that are incurred. As most of you know, my expertise is in water resources, but I'm also a wildlife biologist, as Chris well knows. I'm on the steering committee of the New Hampshire Wildlife Coalition. I mention that because wildlife impacts are often, first and foremost, underserved and not considered, and very rarely factored in terms of any kind of fiscal or monetary way. That may be changing, and if and when, well, not even if, but if the Office of Legislative Services gets done with reviewing Senate Bill 179, which will allow for impacts to rare and endangered species with payments into a mitigation fund, then a project like Olivewood may in fact have some fiscal impact outcomes relative to what they're considering. And that is specific to the black racer snake area that we walked by, talked about, and I recommended, as I did in my report, cutout to protect that species. Olivewood doesn't really have to do that unless Fish and Game says to AOT, you can't have an alteration of terrain permit unless you cut out this, black racer area. Fish and Game could say that, but under this new guise of Senate Bill 179, they may very well just say, go ahead, blow it away, but you got to pay us money to do that.
They're putting a price tag.
They're putting a price tag. Well, this is my question. How do you put a price tag on a snake, let alone putting a price tag on the habitat that you're going to destroy? Because A, you don't know where the habitat begins and ends. You have to put a radio collar or a telemetry unit on the snake to find out how far it goes. And Blanding's turtles, which has been a subject of many, many different radio telemetry studies, moves in very unpredictable, long distance ways. So in other words, it could get very complicated under this new scenario, and that factors into my report relative to how we treat the impacts to wildlife, right? So wetlands, wildlife, and then last but not least, relative to sort of operational safety and operational maintenance of a low impact facility. In this particular case, they're not going to be, super high bright lights, no big towers that are going to chop up birds or bats. I mean, fortunately, a solar facility is a pretty low impact type of land use, even much more low impact than residence or commercial industry or commercial industrial use. So it's quite advantageous. That said, there are still considerations to be had with all solar fields, and we talked about some of those in the field relative to safety and security. What kind of fence is going around it? How is it going to keep out people? How is it going to keep out wildlife to a point, and then allow other wildlife, low wildlife under, a foot underneath the fence to actually be able to move to and from different wetland areas, specifically turtles and snakes, right? Not that snakes have a hard time with a chain link fence, but turtles would, and they could be stopped. And the Chinook solar field in Fitzwilliam that I reviewed, that was a pretty large discussion with the state, as well as Chinook, and it became a part of the memorandum of understanding with Fitzwilliam. You're going to do a double security fence. The first one is to stop everybody from going in while it's being constructed. You yank that one out and leave the inner fence that has the gap underneath it. And of course, then there was some concern about moose and deer and bear and other species that are larger than the 1 foot gap would allow. And we sort of answered that question relative to how significant 127 acres being fenced off is for those species. So all of those things are a part of what I have been retained and offer the town of Webster to consider relative to future impacts at all of it. So your water resources, wildlife, safety and security, operational maintenance, and disposition, long-term disposition of the land. Therein lies sort of the brief overview, and after that, I thought it would be appropriate to first ask all of you for, if you have questions at this point, and then and then thereafter go through some of the specific recommendations, site-specific recommendations that we talked about when we were in the field that Dan and Betsy weren't unfortunately able to see firsthand. And I don't know about you, Dan, if you've been out in that area at all to see the.
I've been out there.
He's one of the abutters.
Ah, you're one of the abutters. Oh, okay. Well, then you know it better than most of us. So very good. And then, of course, I have questions as well relative to actually some of the abuttering lands and how it may affect abutters on a very property-to-property basis versus a town-wide, local, regional sort of impact. So, questions first.
Sure. So you brought up at the start one of the things that I also mentioned when we first looked at the MOUs, which is during a decommission or et cetera, making it so it would go into conservation.
Mm-hmm.
That's fairly easy if it's town-owned land,
Yeah.
such as might be down at the transfer station, or even if it is all of wood purchased land. But the majority of the land is private owners with leases that allow this.
Mm-hmm.
How has that typically been structured to encourage the landowners to want to do conservation after the fact?
Yeah, so most of the medium that affects conservation has to do with valuation of the land, right, and taxes thereon. So, as many of you, most of every of you know, our lowest tax rate is with conservation placed upon it and the public recreation option, which adds another 10% onto a reduction of 10% of the assessed value. The lowest rate, which is conservation, I say, is about equivalent to documented stewardship for mixed hardwoods as a forest type under current use. Right? So if you have land in current use and you've got a forest plan and it's documented, and therefore there's documented stewardship is the bracket, then it's something like $17 a thousand. Okay, so That's how much your tax rate is. If you have a conservation easement on that land, it's about $17 a thousand. So the incentive then is to allow for permanent conservation on the lands that are currently leased and retain that lowest tax value. That of course takes it out of use, okay? And if there is getting beyond deed restrictions and that kind of stuff, if it's a conservation easement, then there has to be a third-party holder. There's usually contribution to that third-party holder for long-term stewardship and monitoring, and it's permanent. Okay, so the incentive then is sheerly monetary. Oh, your tax bill is going to be 1/4 of for that than what you're paying now for having a conservation, and you'll get to know that it's open space the rest of your days. Okay. Another incentive, which is monetarily related, which I learned about firsthand when my wife and I put our land in conservation in 1998, was that the actual value of the land increased for resale. And that's something that's turned roughly around 2000, 2002 or something like that. It shifted. The old adage was, don't put your land in conservation, you'll never be able to sell it. Now it's the other way around. So land that is next to or a part of conservation land, open space land, actually sells faster and higher than it does elsewhere. So it's harder to document that, and it locally shifts based on neighborhoods and stuff, but there's a lot of numbers in that. So there's another argument in case a leasee wants to, or is curious about that option as a long-term approach or choice. Another sort of way to look at that is to establish some type of zoning. Okay, and we've talked about that on the walk a little bit, and that is to say what the Conservation Commission and I believe was the origin. I'm looking at you, Chris, for wetland buffers. Okay, which hasn't passed, but there is an ordinance, and you guys have been working at that. Having a riparian buffer established after the field is all, the panels have been taken out, it's basically been reclaimed, can also happen on a property-wide basis if you can find some type of cash, short term, as it were, to cover the legal expenses of establishing either a deed restriction or an easement on the riparian buffer, the wetland buffers. So that's a less preferable option, but it's also doable. And what you're trying to encourage is the continued protection of the highest value natural resources on that property. Mm-hmm. Deed restrictions, as many of you know, are not as legally binding as conservation easements, but it is an effective lien on someone's property once placed, and that lien has a pretty high hurdle in terms of overcoming them to develop that restriction. We did that in Pembroke. We found out the hard way. We had an old easement, old deed restriction as a part of that, and the lady successfully built a horse barn because the Attorney General's office ruled on that restriction and said it doesn't hold water and you can go ahead and do that. There's all kinds of problems with that situation, but it reminded all of us that deed restrictions they work, but they also are somewhat fallible legally if somebody really wants to get out of it. So, those are another couple options for long-term disposition. Did I answer?
I had a follow-up to
Dan,
that. So, maybe I misunderstood. Did you say current use provides the same value as a conservation easement? So, just as a landowner, why would I want to put it? I would to conserve land, but we're talking about a lot of land. There's a monetary aspect for it to go back in current use, and then it can be developed by the landowner at some point as well. Is that?
Yeah, yeah, I mean, if it's in current use now, and it's.
They have to pay the back taxes.
They have to pay the back taxes, right, and they have to pay that, land use change tax if they develop. It's conservation, they would never
Okay.
have that option to do that. Effectively, you're protecting it long-term without, so.
Now, what was your experience with the memorandum of understanding? So I thought when we were looking through some of them, at the end of the 40 years, the solar company has the option to come in and perhaps put new panels in,
Yeah.
as opposed to just walking away.
Right,
So-
right.
It would-
And that is really, it's really up to the town. And so every town looks at it differently. Bennington, for example, Vermont, was, the way they looked at it is that they wanted the developer to hold to the lease term, period. And after that, they're done. And they did so because in their long-term townwide or city plan, I don't know if it's a city or town, Bennington, Vermont, but in any case, in their long-term master plan, this was part of their next big box store expansion. It was right behind Home Depot, right? And so they looked at that land as, oh, this is a natural, we built the Beltway, and now we're gonna develop inside the Beltway and try and keep all the green stuff on the outside of the Beltway. Well, this was inside the Beltway. So their memorandum of understanding basically said, yeah, you're gonna have it, that lease will be allowable for 40 years, if I'm not mistaken. But after that, you have to renegotiate that with the city. And there were permits involved that are not involved here. Again, it's a different governmental jurisdiction and has a different set of rules. There's also Vermont Act 250, which has its own set of rules on regulated development and timelines, and it's not the same as here. Here it's a little bit more of a rodeo. That's it.
I have two questions.
Sure.
The easy one is, have you ever heard of waterfowl flying over a solar panel field and thinking it's water
I haven't
crashing
heard.
into the panels?
Yeah, no, I haven't heard of that.
Well, it's something, it's in my brain. I read it some time ago somewhere. This had happened, so I just was curious. You haven't heard of that?
No,
happen?
I
Okay.
haven't.
They look down, they see a reflecting black
Yeah.
space, and they think it's water.
Yeah.
And they try to land on it.
Yeah, I mean,
But I don't know if that's-
it may, I mean, I can understand why somebody would think that might be an issue, but don't forget the panels have a pretty good space between them.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like not
Yeah.
a small amount of green that's coming up between this.
Yeah, I know.
Water,
I
so-
just had to remember.
Yeah.
My other question is, I'm a landowner.
Yes,
I have land just south of Deer Meadow Brook
okay,
and right across from the location of the project. And I'm concerned about this Deer Meadow Brook crossing. Is it
Yes.
going to be, what kind of a bridge is it going to be? It's going to be right next to my land, and what does it mean? What does it mean for my
Yeah,
land?
so are you on the north side of that crossing? To the north?
No, on the south.
You're on the south side of the crossing?
South side of the brook.
So you're south side of the brook. Russ, do you know where she's
And-
at?
And I don't understand,
Yeah.
So the
a
existing
road
bridge.
crossing is going to just go to another area of panels. It's not going all the way up to Garrish Road.
No, it's just going to another area that is what, about
Uh-huh.
25, 30 acres of panels on the north side of the brook. So there's an existing woods road, right, that has 3 culverts. There's a road that comes from the south, the main area, the south.
Yeah, I just don't, I
part.
don't know that area very
And-
much. I just
yeah.
know my land, which is goes from Garrish Road all the way over to the brook. And it's lovely wild land, and Carol and I have made trails on it, and we ski on it.
Yeah.
And it's good wildlife territory, and I'm concerned.
Yeah. Can I ask you, because it would help me, if you can point that out on the map?
Yeah, I think so.
And while he does that, just to help
Because I haven't
clarify
seen a
for you, the bridge that's being talked about is an existing bridge and crossing that's using culverts and would be upgraded to be better quality.
Where is that now?
Do we have another map?
This is south, and then north.
Sure.
What are
And-
you talking about on
That's
Johnny
the old
Mills
gravel
land?
pit.
Yeah,
That's ATV trails and
that
everything.
existing crossing.
Where's Garrish Road?
That,
No.
because this is Deer
Yeah,
Meadow.
it's
Yeah.
not, it's not
Okay.
too garish.
So,
Garrish Road is my land road. Garrish Road over to
here's
the
the
brook.
transfer
That is
driveway
driveway
that
that
goes
goes
over.
over, or is it
Yeah,
another road
I
down
can't.
And that's
It was
subdivision.
one of the, it was one of the logging trail
I think
things
it
that
was
we
on the tax
walked
map.
on.
On a tax map.
And
Yes.
I don't think, Betsy, I don't think,
You don't think on anything?
you
No.
can kind of get to
It's-
it
this
if you
is
go
Johnny
out the
Little's
back
land
end of
on
the,
Deer Meadow.
Yeah, but I'm not
Sam,
going.
Right by,
the-
right by.
so the back, it's between the sand pit
Right
and
behind
Yes,
the
but
transfer
I'm
station.
across from-
Okay.
If you follow
But I
their
don't think that Garrish Road is
four-wheeling
there.
slash logging roads,
It's
one of
far.
them crosses the brook,
You stand out
and it's an
from Garrish Road.
existing bridge with culverts that he and they are
Yeah, yeah,
suggesting
I'm sure,
get
sure.
upgraded to a better
I
quality
suspect
bridge.
it's down.
I only have been out there on that years ago. I
Because,
just asked, because
again, this is Deer Meadow Road.
And the intent of that is to get
And
them
this, like I
them
said,
to the
crossing is
transfer
right
building?
about it here.
The intent of that was to
Transfer station.
enhance the ability of the water and the wetland wildlife
Yes,
to
and
be able
that's,
to
I
move
don't
back
know
and
the
forth
names.
as
Maybe
opposed to
names.
only the culverts that were there.
Yeah, because there's a couple.
So it's mainly a wetlands mitigation
3, 4, 5, 6,
process
7, 8 lots
and
there,
in purpose. There are several
I
other
think this is
smaller
Paul's,
crossings
right?
that are like a small box culvert that are currently there or similar, or that were just filled in, that he's recommended that be removed so that it's just a wetland
And I thought
passage
they were
again.
right across
Yeah,
from.
but I
not
guess
far
what
from
I'm
Little's
trying to
land.
figure out is what is the intent of what are they gonna use the culverts for, to transfer
Okay,
the power line?
I feel better about it.
Yeah.
Oh, no.
Thank you,
This
Rick.
this is within the wetlands,
Just the mitigation of the.
just to,
Yep.
and it currently has culverts, like several culverts
Yep.
that the wetlands pass through. And the enhanced portion of this, or the mitigation, would be remove all of that and make it a more proper bridge so that the wetland itself and the movement of the natural wildlife within the wetland is not as constrained as it currently is.
So it has nothing to do with getting it over to the, getting.
Correct.
Okay.
And so the passage, for all intents and purposes, I do not see, well, to put it this way, you could include it in the MOU. According to Craig Rennie, who's recently left the Wetlands Bureau, he was one of the more forward-thinking people at the Bureau. 2/3 of the permits that are issued for stream crossings are alternative designs, what they call alternative designs, which means they don't meet Chapter 900 requirements. Chapter 900 is the stream crossing rules. This is part of the ENV-WT, and that was rewritten about 5.5, 6 years ago, updated. The reason for that had a lot to do with the Hurricane Irene and Vermont's experience with what happens when your culverts are too small and you got a lot of rain, right? So I would look into including a clause in the MOU that states all stream crossings will be held to Chapter 900 rules so that they don't apply for an alternative design, but in fact do the full, crossing assessment. And I don't know TRC whether they've done that, because this is a private crossing, so that's not in the database. But the state has established, prior to the rewrite of the rules, a protocol for evaluating the stream crossing. To wit, you have 3 different components, you evaluate each one, you rank each one of them, and that gets fed into the design parameters, which then meet the state's requirements. Right? So that would be something that I would consider putting in your memorandum of understanding with all of them. Because right now, as I said, Craig said that 2/3 are alternatives, so they could go for an alternative design, in which case, what the state typically does is place a bunch of conditions on that permit. sometimes they require mitigation, right? Sometimes, oh, it's an alternative design, well, you still gotta pay by doing some type of mitigation, either on-site, off-site, in the neighborhood, or paying into the ARM fund. So that's how most alternative designs get permitted. But I would say a full design to state specs under Chapter 100 would be a recommendation for that crossing. And that's not inexpensive. I mean, the reason why it's a big deal is because of the difference between, in that case, you could replace those 3 culverts with new culverts of the same size as an alternative design, inferior, I might add, but get away with that. And that cost would be in the order of about $160,000 to $80,000 ballpark. You do a proper design, full scale, engineered, we're talking about $1 million. That's how different the money is. And that, so, because that span, I got the GPS on it, and you remember, that span's pretty, it's not that the double culvert is a wide span, but the floodplain channel, which has the 3rd culvert, that added another 40 or 50 feet onto the design parameters. And so if you're doing an elevated crossing, and my guess is that they would probably do 2 arch crossings, each arch, just to pay for the arch crossing for a small road, not a class 5 highway or anything like that, but a small road, is going to be $700,000 for 2 of them.
For each crossing.
No, for each arch span, for both arch span culvert, but to $350, $350,000, excuse me, for I get it straight. So in other words, it's a lot more money to do it to full spec standard, and that would be the reason that they would seek to do an alternative design. But you want the best out there that you can get. And again, I'm throwing around numbers. Don't hold on to them because, I've only got a couple decades of experience here. I'm not an engineer. Right? My ARM fund experience, we permit probably about 20 some odd culverts a year in terms of paying money to have culverts replaced, bridges built, etc. About 20 a year. Just the numbers that float by my desk when I'm part of the team approving those payments. So, it's considerable. It's at least 3 to 4 times more money to do it the right way. So that's one of the biggest impacts, clearly. Therefore, it was prominent in my report. A couple of the other ones we walked on, that dirt track. You remember we got to those tiny concrete culverts that have been there for 50 years or whatever.
And they're mostly clogged.
And mostly not working at all. No aquatic organism passage or anything. I recommended, and this is something that they could work with existing. They would not, if they didn't change anything about that roadway, or they didn't touch the culverts, they could leave them. They don't have to replace them in order to do their work. Okay? But a request made, as I suggested, that you replace those to improve the passage of these failing small culverts would not be a bad thing, especially in that area where that little wetland was pinched off, and Jamie and I are looking at it and we're going, gee, they didn't capture this wetland on this side, they did on this side. And you remember Dana turned around and said, yeah, we're going to have to go back to the shop and remap that. So they missed it. That's part of what we do. I did that in Fitzwilliam. I went out with Dana, we looked at, and it wasn't because it was in the panel area, it was where the substation was going to go. They didn't map any wetlands, and they had wetlands in the substation. I'm like, you want to have wetlands not present in an area that a lot of voltage is going through these transformers. So he had to go back and remap that substation area based on my investigations, and I saw it in the aerial formula. So that's the kind of thing it's almost SOP in terms of how these guys who have big parcels start drilling into the details of how to develop them. So when we get those updated maps back from TRC, I'll take a look at those and see if they captured some of those changes. And I'll also, as we at that point in time, in terms of my coming up with the second sort of set of review standards, include, again, repeat what I wrote in here in terms of replacing those concrete culverts and our understops. Because, what, if you're gonna be in there, you may as well do the right thing. And it will help them over the long term. Because, it's a lot of sand, but if it floods, it makes the road impassable or icy or whatever, it's gonna be a maintenance nightmare for them. So, same thing with that ATV crossing, which you pointed out, thank you. I looked at it and went, yeah, okay, Rock Forge, whatever, but truth be told, a culvert in that place, in that location would be preferable. It would prevent some siltation going down into that wetland, even though, it's not a heavy flow in that channel. It's mostly a wetland and not a stream. So,
See maps.
Sorry?
We keep being promised maps.
So we have
yeah.
these maps that we sent out, which include and have had in other meetings that we've displayed, which are the potential panel areas.
Yeah.
So those are the maps that we've gotten from them.
Okay.
By them I mean Olivewood. And that's what we have for mapping at this point.
Mm-hmm.
We haven't really been promised a timeline on any other specific maps because they're working with us as they go through the process. I know that they've got feedback from Rick in his report, as well as the on-site walk for, hey, we think you should do this over here, this over there, and they said they were going to consider all of that.
Can I get a copy of the map? Then I can take it home and figure out just exactly where things are.
Yeah, absolutely. So
Really like
you
that.
saw the map that he just brought over for a second, right?
Yeah, I wasn't.
So we can have Russ get you a copy of that after the meeting.
If I had a copy of it, I could
Yeah,
figure it all out.
we'll have him print you copies
Yeah.
after.
Thank you.
So yes, other than that, further mapping would be kind of the next stage, and that would be more the civil design that most people would start to recognize, where it's, okay, this is where we are expecting a fence, this is where we're expecting panels, this is where we're expecting access roads. That sort of thing will probably be the next map that we get. We don't have a timeline for it.
Okay. Thank you.
That map would be made off your recommendations most likely though, or what you found on your.
Yeah, so and that gets to my sort of last major point, and that has to do with this northerly portion of the proposed panel area. And we walked up there, Dan and Betsy, and I sort of knew going into it what my recommendation was going to be, and seeing the stony bouldery till up there, I was suggesting that this high wetland interspersion, vernal pool area, and this bony rocky ridge not be used for panels, but that in this north lot, that the field basically would be where the panels should go in that lot. In other words, there's the substation, and you can get across that wetland. It's not a big deal in terms of what they've got to do for cabling to connect this field with the substation, because they're going to do the same thing with all the panel arrays here, connect them up. And that land where the substation was planned, it's fine. It's upland woods. But I noticed that once we started getting up in this low ridge, these wetlands were high value, and the ridge was just very challenging terrain, put it that way, for panel construction. So in order to do that, to make it suitable for panel, I think the impacts would be too great and too close to some high value wetlands. So I recommended against developing that portion. And to be honest, we're talking about less than 6% of the total field area. So I didn't hear any significant concern that Dom expressed.
So if I may, just to clarify, looking at the field from So I abut the other side of where you're talking about the hill.
Okay.
So my land goes the whole length from the vernal pond
Yeah,
all the way out to the power line.
okay,
So they have two lots there that they're using. One is the large field and the other
Yeah.
one where the substation will go.
yeah.
So are you referring to high value, the pond that, or the brook that runs on the outer loop of that, right at the base of that steep
No,
portion?
I'm talking about on the other side of that low ridge, it would be,
Kind of
Dan,
north side of the proposed
Uh,
substation.
yeah, it's this unit here, Dan. So this is the field,
Yep.
and that wetland area, that's,
That's what I was referring
pretty, no, I'm talking about this wetland area.
to. Okay. gotcha.
That's really pretty neat stuff, and we took a quick look in there. It's one of those things that I'm used to, but not most people are. You look around at land in the state, and the best land is the land that is not developed in terms of ecological value. And typically wetlands, you have old growth systems in wetlands. That's where I'd say most of our old growth forest types are in the state. Big swamps and wetlands and stuff. And that's, and so the probability with a steep rocky ridge and the development, or the type of construction that would make that suitable for an array, it is very high that it would be damaged by virtue of that construction, the integrity of that unit. Because when we go through the Aquatic Resource Mitigation Fund requirements under our conservation easements, it's a 250-foot buffer. And that's, you won't see that anywhere else in the Northeast. There's no state or federal or local government that requires that big a buffer. And that's because we understand, based on our research, and we've got some white papers out there to show that research off, that wildlife require 300 feet, 100 meters on the average. That's an average value for intact riparian buffers. So, we get that in the ARM fund, and because we're effectively non-jurisdiction, we can make those calls, but nobody else can. And they'll build right up to the edge of it and compromise the heck out of it. Either from runoff or nutrient exchange or cowbirds and invasive plants, you name it, it will change. So another reason to leave the highest value intact wetlands in situ without having any disturbance. That's not like that one at the base of the hill. That one's been all chopped and cut and damaged and all kinds of stuff in there. It's a very different unit.
And so to help those who have seen the maps and who have put them on previous streams and meetings, it is important to note that what's listed is what the phrase potential panel areas, and that is a significantly larger area than the amount that they expect to be covered with panels. This is what the initial engineering report said you could possibly put panels here. So it's not we are going to put panels on every place that this map shows as potential panel area. And so they, for example, even before we went up there and looked at it, said that this section up top where it's non-contiguous area near all of these wetlands, we don't intend to try to use that. But of course it is on this map as potentially that could be usable under the right circumstances. But that's a point it needs to be cleared that not every single thing on that map is expected to be used.
Yep. And that's the same with the one up in Conway, that we're working on. We have, there are areas up there that, it's a lot of gravel, sand gravel, but there are some tilts that come down. It's very bouldery, rocky, steep. And, they know that. That's why they call out 400 acres. When they presented to the town of Conway, they said, realistically, if we get 350 out of 400, we're doing well, right, in terms of cutouts. Then Tin Mountain and TNC, we put our own recommendations for buffers on wetlands, streams, and they've got one listed exemplary natural community that they want to buffer out a little bit. And so that's what we did a site walk in, this was June, early June, maybe that. And we all kind of agreed, So then of course, that's all good and well, you're in the field, you're talking, chat, then the new specs come in, the new plans, and then we see if in fact they are going to do what we requested them to do, and then, of course, apply the necessary reminder pressure that we need to, so that when the MOU comes downtown, they can recognize that. And I would say the same thing here. If there's, especially some of the recommendations that I made for like the black racer, you have a full right to include that as a part of your agreement, considering that, this is a real exchange. I mean, yes, and we talked about this very, very beginning, Dan, in the sidewalk, and Betsy, we talked about how, my first impression from the maps is a pretty reasonable place to put a panel there. Pretty flat, wouldn't drain, already used, nothing exemplary in terms of old growth or any of that stuff. Rare species, one of the couple, but not the ones that we, that would impact the primary large areas. Yeah, okay, fine. That's a good, check. Let's move forward. There are panel arrays that had been proposed when I worked on again in Vermont, where I was shaking my head from the very beginning. These guys are nuts. We don't even sure. Just trying to get through the operational basis for not just permitting but construction. So that was not the case here. This seems, at least to me, environmental. I think there's some really good potential here. And then beyond that, it's an electric, it's an energy grid kind of. How much? I mean, the Northern Pass, same thing. Oh yeah, it's great. We're not going to see any of that power, but that's not the case here, from what I understand.
Well, no, they're going onto the high voltage lines. Those are not staying in the state.
None of this is staying in the state?
Nope. No, I asked that question at the last meeting.
They're all going to Massachusetts, right?
And that's where those lines go.
Yep.
He stuttered through that response.
Because they first tried with the smaller one. Was it 35 megawatts that they?
Yeah,
And
I don't remember the number, but it's the one that goes right across in front of the transfer
and that,
station.
I said back then that line can't support that. And that was the end result. The line couldn't support an interconnect of that size. So now they're going to tie into the 230,000 volt lines, assuming they get the interconnect agreement.
Right, and he said something about that where, basically they have to get all their ducks in a row, the SEC, everything else, before they.
Yeah, Dom seemed pretty confident about it. I'm not familiar with that process.
So I was, maybe I misunderstood this, but I thought there was a portion that was going to be regionally planned.
Not from what, maybe I misunderstood. No, from what he said at the last meeting, it was all going on those, that would be a logistical nightmare, I think. You'd need two separate substations, because you'd be transmitting to two different voltages, right? You're going to take whatever.
It's all expecting to go onto that transmission line. And as far as the keeping power in New Hampshire thing, what he tried to point out was physics is physics, but where you sell the power is the quote important part. And so ISO New England is of course all of New England. It's not just New Hampshire or Massachusetts, etc. So the power probably goes into Massachusetts and serves something there as far as the actual flow of the electricity. But in theory, they would be selling to other New Hampshire towns and residents, is the way that they phrased what they were trying to do.
Yeah, there's no way of parsing that out. Once
Yeah.
it goes to ISO, ISO is just saying, hey, energy companies, send us what you can. This is what we need each day. They get that in, and once they get that in, they're just feeding it out to the masses to use. So once that comes in, but there's no way of knowing where particles 1 through 12 go and what state it went to. There's just no way of.
Yeah, power purchase agreements are separate from where electricity actually flows. And what I think they were trying to talk about was the power purchase agreements and trying to serve New Hampshire that way. But that would be a really good question to ask them next time we have them.
Absolutely.
Just to make sure that they fully clarify what their intent and expectation is.
My understanding though was one substation and it feeds the high voltage lines.
Correct.
I mean, admittedly, I cannot be, truth be told, because I'm an ecologist, bound by the state line, right? We're talking about, at the very least, critters that are coming from, South America and using this land. So to think that we have to, Northern Pass is something different. That was a different sort of arrangement that had a lot for me to do with Hydro-Quebec and the damage they've done up there, supporting that project. But here again, like you said, ISO, power purchase power agreements. Yeah, well, who says that the power won't be used by New Hampshire, right, in some way, in many ways. So I'm not really, that's not a deal breaker for me. Chris?
Can I ask a couple of questions?
Please.
I have two questions. So Olivewood has a new venture, correct? Is that Tin Mountain, or is that another one?
A new venture.
Yeah, a new. They're entering. They're going after putting on another solar.
Another array.
Oh.
I
Already.
believe that was the 100 something that you mentioned, that was Conway, was it?
Well, that one, Conway, when did this one surface in Webster? How long has this been in your
You mean a couple of years ago?
couple of years?
Yeah.
When this was created, it was, or upgraded to the 75, it was the largest on the map at the current time, and it no longer is because of the.
Yeah, so Conway came in to our sort of the public network, and we were one of the first people contacted because we were in butter in November 2018. That's when I learned about it.
And the public notification of that was
Was
a month or two ago?
yeah, it was. They had their first
Okay,
Conway
so that's
public
what I'm
hearing.
thinking.
That's where Conway had their public hearing.
Okay.
Yeah, and that's the
way.
first public notice. Yeah, they're hearing that at the town hall and stuff. Yeah.
So you've worked with Olivewood before. I'm concerned, well, I'm not concerned. I'm just curious as to what you think about their bandwidth to be able to handle, big projects, simultaneous big
Yeah.
projects like this.
Yeah, I don't think that is as much of an issue as who they sell it to, right? And who's sort of picking up. They're effectively, they've got, as you know, a PR team that Dom's a part of. And that's what he does. And he, is under contract with Olivewood Energy to, present this, work all of this stuff out with permitting and public visibility, blah, blah, blah. And then he goes away. And Olivewood, as another sort of entity that effectively is the named entity in the SEC permit, gets done with all that and sells it to NextEra, which is an international corporation that is, you probably know more about NextEra, but they were behind, I think, all 5 of my Vermont solar fields. They're behind Chinook. Okay, the name Chinook is, again, is a locational name for them, but NextEra owns that facility, as it will own this one, and it was owned
Well,
Conway.
my question is really about, how much can they handle up front?
I don't see why they can't. I haven't seen any signs of, oh gee, they're a company that's gonna go under or have a problem with this or anything like that. I don't see that.
Okay.
I don't get that at all.
Good.
Yep.
Second question. It's come to light that there are significant environmental impacts on that big old clearing we went up to. 100,000 acres of land has been altered probably without any permitting, and they have asked for documentation from the company that is responsible for this.
Where are we talking?
That big open field that we were up, that 90-acre field that
Oh.
abuts Dan's land.
Okay, yeah, you said 100,000.
I think you meant 100 acres.
You said 1,000, I
You said
thought.
100,000.
100,000 square feet.
Ah,
It's over 100,000 square.
Sorry, appear to have been altered.
Wow.
Yeah, okay, yes.
So,
Yeah, so no AOT permit was issued for
nothing,
that clearing.
not that any of us know about.
Right.
So my question about this is really about DES process.
Yeah.
Since they have asked for documentation from these people by June 30th, if the documentation doesn't come through or whatever, I'm wondering whether there's going to be some kind of conflict between what DES is going to require to happen on that land to mitigate what they have done and what the solar folks are going to want to get in there and do. I don't know how any of that.
Yeah, so I'm in another situation that's experiencing almost the exact same thing, okay? And it's all public knowledge, like I mentioned it. Doug Ignerson, who owns the Dalton drag strip, where Casella Waste Systems is proposing a regional landfill, had the same issue with when they expanded their gravel pit, an asphalt plant. They didn't get a permit. AOT they got cited for it, and they're doing restoration of certain areas of the gravel pit for that purpose, even though if Casella gets its way, 200 acres, including that gravel pit, will be effectively recontoured and altered for the landfill. So DES has experience and the capacity of looking at the sort of embedded permits that are after the fact versus considering upcoming permits. And in this case, what they did, and I'm sure they would do the same thing, is they would set their conditions for how the applicant would need to meet the terms of the permit, in this case an alteration of terrain permit, which is pretty straightforward, okay? If you're not destroying wetlands and you're not impacting, did they destroy wetlands on the 100,000?
As part of that.
Yeah.
Illegal culverting and all that sort of stuff.
Well, then that has to be corrected according to according to state law. Whether it is corrected is how good DES, talking about bandwidth, their regional inspectors can go out and actually look at it and then set terms and monitor it and require reports that check all the boxes for the restoration work. That I can't answer because everything's, as you know, resource scarce in our state government. Yeah, but that shouldn't. I mean, again, given the timing of, they're talking about possibly breaking ground next year. I think that's optimistic. I think it'd be more like November, December before all things said and done in 2022, which is plenty of time if this non-permitted thing. Because usually the restoration order is a 60-day thing, and they can extend it, but they have 60 days to fix it, basically. Or apply for an extension, and they can extend it for another 60 days. And, there are rules that regulate, so it's a timely thing. This should be all done by the time all of it gets in. Yeah.
To be clear, that is the previous, the landowner that is not all of it, correct?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's a big holding company.
Just making sure, because it was these guys.
Yeah.
Or something to that effect.
So where it gets, somewhat more interesting and complicated, and I would mention this in the talk again, Dan and Betsy, was if there is mitigation required for any of the wetland or water resource impacts that they do intend to incur, because it's not just the Deer Meadow stream crossing, that's the big one. But if they do it to design specs, there won't be any mitigation required for that. Okay, because they're actually going to be improving, enhancing the passage. But below the beaver pond, that access road, if they're going to go up to the substation, they're going to have to build that access road up and culvert it or do low underpasses, something, and try and prevent the beaver from making a dam out of that roadway. That's more of a challenge in my eyes than the other stuff that I saw. So there may be mitigation involved with that, and that's why we talked about possible mitigation options as on-site mitigation options may include restoring some of those wetlands that were damaged for that 100,000 square foot area that was cleared without permit. So, maybe they go and have to spray for ticks.
Oh, my God.
Yeah.
That was entertaining, yes.
Yeah.
The number of ticks was impressive.
So does that answer your question?
Yep,
Okay,
thanks.
great. Other questions? Dan, anybody? You have any other?
When you mentioned beaver pond, you're talking about the one on the power lines?
Yeah, that's right.
Because there's two other ones.
Yeah,
Both of those brooks that come together right there
Yeah.
have one as well.
Yeah, we were going in that direction, and I think it was Dana who looked on his satellite and said, we gotta go back. We had to walk all the way back up to the upper crossing. There's a little beaver pond in the way. So yeah, that's that pond that's right under the power lines, that access road, which of course they've got to work out with Eversource, because that's going to be a maintenance road for them as well. That's the road to the substation, so they've got to upgrade that and all those graded crossings.
Is there anything that has to do with the wetlands? And you mentioned that it's not a big issue,
Yeah.
but to get from the power lines to the substation, there is that brook we're talking about.
Yeah.
What do they do, or do they need to do, or is that a relatively simple process? Do they go under the pond, through the pond, over the pond?
So that's what I think, at least Dom, and I don't think Dana was kind of silent on it, and I don't think Dom was saying much, but I think the plan was to use the existing roadway that goes just below the dam, Beaver Dam, and upgrade that. Okay, and I'm guessing that, if they did it right, I can see at least two spans. Two spans, not culverts, spans.
Yeah.
Because the culverts are going to just block right up.
Right.
But if you have a span that's 8 feet wide, 4 feet high, whether it's an arch span or a box culvert, it's a lot harder to block up and a lot easier to maintain with a beaver excluder and fencing and stuff to keep that road from them not using that road for a dam in and of itself, which is sure and shooting what they're going to do if they don't do it right.
I'm probably the only person here who's paddled a canoe from the transfer station all the way up Deer Meadow Brook,
Wow.
pushing over those beaver dams. Yep,
Yeah, so that's an effort, a lot of work.
yep, it was fun though.
Yeah, sure is. Canoes, even talk about kayak, a little small kayak, you can kind of
Yeah, the kind
lift
of,
yourself up.
this is a good.
But anyway, that'll be, so that's an unknown, is whether or not mitigation will be required as a part of this. But, that's a state decision and something that I will review for the town and make sure that they're holding their feet to the fire. Simple.
I do have one more little question.
Sure.
Speaking of the spans, if spans were put in there, wouldn't that drain the wetland?
No,
Why?
because it's below the dam, right? It would be below the current beaver dam. So whatever
But
outflow.
it was draining out in that spot, as you walked sloshing through the water
Right,
there.
right.
On the left-hand side was where it was draining to.
Right,
So if the road, forget the road, if now we have spans,
yeah.
wouldn't the wetland on the right just drain out? It
No,
wouldn't.
No, not as
Okay.
long as the dam wasn't damaged or
I can't
disturbed.
remember where the dam was there.
It was on your right-hand side, not very far from the road. We
Oh, you
pretty-
mean right, the decrepit thing?
The
Yeah.
beaver dam, yeah, it was right. We were walking along the road,
Yeah.
and the beaver dam was on our right, and
Yeah.
there were several points where it was flowing over the dam, and
Yeah.
that's what the water we were walking through. So,
Yeah.
at least two, probably three spans. If they're going to try and meet the existing condition, and that's really the trick, because engineering, you could engineer one crossing, by ditching and diversion of the outflow into one single crossing. But that's not what I would, if I were doing it, in the most ecologically correct way.
So the road would actually be above that dam?
Well, the road level may be at the level of the dam.
Oh,
Yeah. The dam, keep in mind, was about, it's about 3-4 feet maybe?
The dam was at least a couple feet above where we were walking.
Yeah, at least a couple. So, if you raise it probably would be higher, probably, because to do a box culvert, especially if it's a suitable underpass, Most of these things are 4 feet, 3 or 4 feet up, and then you'd have a road bed on top of that. So yeah, probably it'd be above the level again, you're right.
So how big is the space for the solar array on that, after the brook crossing?
Yeah.
How big is that area that they're
Which
planning?
brook crossing are you
On
talking
the
about?
west side. You know, I told you that my land was on the south side, it's on
Yeah.
the west side.
On the west side, yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense.
That's been bothering me ever since.
Yeah. So going around that beaver pond,
Yeah.
to the substation, then to get to the array, they would still have to cross that sort of stream ditch, as it were, that's next to the big open field, to get to that array. And there's an existing crossing there. And we looked at it, we walked over it, I took some pictures of it. So it's really, that isn't really gonna be an issue.
Okay.
For them to
I gotta
get
look
to
at
that.
this existing crossing.
There's a
Think
crossing
we're-
there?
Yeah. Well,
It's like a logging crossing.
Yeah,
It's
it's like
a
a
fairly hefty bridge.
pretty hefty
Like
bridge.
logging.
Between where the substation and the power line?
Oh, no, between the substation and the field, the
And
open
the
field.
empty,
Gotcha.
the
Whose
cut
land is it
field.
go over onto?
That's onto the Horizon Holdings land.
Whose land used to be?
Are you worried about the bridge crossing near your, yeah, she's on the other side of the road.
Yeah, so
That's
he
what-
was just talking about the substation and that
Oh, the
crossing, which is the
substation's way
north
up
side.
there. on the
Yeah.
left, on
So
the
she's
east side,
talking
yeah.
about the first
Oh, yeah.
bridge and that one with the culverts down in the
Yeah, it's a
I
different,
think little property.
yeah.
A little property.
Right.
Okay, yeah, thank you, a little bit.
So it's within their
Big
network
little
of
property.
trails
The big
and
little property.
logging access.
Are there any other species besides the black racer that you're worried about in that area? Or any other mitigation for other animals? I mean, other than turtles or snakes going under? I mean, I know in the state, there's not many deer per square mile, but in that one particular piece of woods, anyone that's been in there,
Yeah,
there's quite a few deer in that piece of woods.
yeah.
Moose too,
Well,
I've
they
seen
won't
moose
be-
there.
When the
Well,
culvert-
no, I don't know how tall they're building the fence. I suppose it depends how tall the fence is, but
Yeah, no, the fence will be big, tall enough to exclude deer, that's part of the deal. Of course, there's as much of a safety issue there as anything. But, yeah, because we talked about, what, are you gonna mow it, with sheep or whatever. But, no, they're, the only, one of the biggest offsets that people don't often think about, but it's significant, and it's one that we built into some design parameter requests, is pollinators and bats. Okay, so you want to maintain a native growth, understory growth that has ample numbers of native pollinator suitable species, and if you have to, because after you rub it out and level it, you're going to have to conservation mix the thing. As long as you get good legumes going in, and trifolium and all that stuff, you're going to get a good release of. And so having the timing of the mowing such that pollinator habitat is effectively being created in the panel is one, and then having an open pollinator habitat is great for bats, especially when you're near water. And that's something that, I'm working with Scott Reynolds right now on a couple of projects with that guy, and, we walk in the woods, he goes, yeah, okay, whatever, I'm not putting an acoustic station here, we're gonna go to the open areas, and that's where you either flyways, doesn't take much, he said, 20 feet, enough of a flyway for bats, so over a stream bed, or in this case, now you got open fields, so it's actually an enhancement for those species. Yeah, there'll be some losers, but there are definitely some gainers. But none others that I can think of that would, that are on the state list, the 40 species. So, yeah, but I think bats are. I mean, you get one long-eared, red, small-footed, pipistrelle. They're all on the state list. Eastern pipistrelle.
Oh,
bat.
okay.
Yeah, so, we got 4 bats on the state list, 1 on the federal
Yep.
list. And not that we're gonna get northern long-eared out there, but we very well could get some of the other 3 woodland bats that are state listed. So, there's potential gainers in that regard. Good questions. Good questions. Any others? Any other
good for all of the pollinators if they get, you know, this sort of mix. Is there any sense in trying to also hook up with like beekeepers or some sort of association that can actively maintain a pollinator colony or hive in an area at the same time?
Yeah, I mean, there's, well, two thoughts I have, right? First off, sure, why not? You know, public visibility win-win situation, why not? To be truthful, however, as you may or may not know, honeybees are a very small fraction of our pollinator suite.
Right.
So, you know, once you get done with adrenids and calidids and the orchid bees, which represent probably about 40% of our pollinator suite, you know, then you've got a whole host of others that have nothing to do with beehives.
Right.
You know, so and they'll respond accordingly. I mean, I've done a few pollinator studies down in Peterborough. I did some annual surveys of whatever, you know, in certain plots, and looked at the species. And yeah, it was honeybees were pretty rare, and we had hives right there on the farm. So, you know, they're honeybees, as you probably know, are pretty specific, and they're very communal. So they get the word from the scouts, and the scouts come back, and basically they go to where the scouts don't go, and they'll swarm on, you know, stuff or whatever it is that they bring them to, and they'll avoid everything else. So that's what makes them, you know, somewhat really good for almond orchards, you know, out west, because, you know, everybody's one plant. You know,
It makes them really good for
really
what?
good for like tree orchards.
Oh, okay.
Almond, particularly
Almond,
almond orchards in
Yeah.
the Central Valley. I mean, you can't pass one without seeing a whole row of hives.
Mhm.
Yeah. So, but anyway, so that's a good question, but it's still the first answer about having the PR value and hives present and available is a good one. I mean, it helps communicate the message that, you know, we're not just putting up panels and forgetting about the environment. We're integrating them as much as we can with the existing.
In the winter, why don't the panels get all covered with snow? Because they're fairly flat.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I've, you know, I've had some experience with that. But believe it or not, the panels are surfaced with material that prevents ice buildup, and then B, of course, they generate heat, enough heat that they melt the ice and snow
I have
off very
panels.
quickly.
Yeah, we have panels on our
Yeah,
boat.
they clear up pretty
But
fast.
Even though it's quite steep, the snow will stay on there for a while.
Yeah, they'll stay out for a while,
Yeah.
and of course,
They
you know,
still
that's,
produce though.
they'll still produce.
Right through the snow?
Right through the snow.
Yeah.
Yeah, they don't.
It won't be as much.
It won't be as much.
Right. But they do produce.
Yeah, it's amazing. I know. It's, you know.
I know. It's great having those.
Yeah, just you know, what I read yesterday about the electric vehicle. You know, what we're going to see in the next 5 years.
Yeah.
Pretty exciting.
Yeah, and to go on that, I actually asked that while we were on the walk about what they thought and cared about for the snow factor. And there are many things that you can do. Some is, of course, you know, the angle of the panel. Some are coatings like he was talking about on the panel. The majority of cases, they just don't care because they're still getting power, just not a lot, and then it's going to go off. And sure, we're going to have a few storms where it's going to stick on there for a while, but that's only a few storms. Most of them, it's going to go on, and then over the course of the next day of, you know, or two of sun, it's going to all melt off anyway, even if the panels weren't active. And the panels will be generating both heat and electricity underneath it to melt that off and become more efficient anyway. There are other technical options that are possible if, for example, you were up in an Arctic area where they constantly froze over, or if they tried to run them on top of like Mount Washington, for example. You can actually run power through them in reverse and turn them into a heater. But that degrades the lifespan of the panel. So If you need to do it for survival, as in an off-grid situation, you might do something like that. But
Keep
for,
that in mind, Betsy.
Yeah.
Very cool.
Yeah, you and your
Yeah.
but for this sort of situation, they're just gonna map out and engineer it for maximum output and account for the snow reducing that output.
All right, well, I pretty much got through my,
All right.
If anybody, I don't know if anybody will get a copy of that.
Yeah, I'd love it.
Thanks, Rick.
Yeah,
This was good.
sure.
Yes,
Thank
thank
you
you very much.
This
Rick,
was
can I
good.
ask one follow-up question
Yeah,
from
please.
earlier on? You
Yeah.
mentioned,
See, here's my picture of,
you kind of made a
there's,
quick comment
there's a
regarding,
stream,
One second.
regarding the
there's our
wildlife.
land.
Just a second, Betsy. Yeah, go ahead.
You made a quick comment regarding the wildlife,
like
the
that.
question was asked, and you said, yeah, we looked at the whole area and what the impact on the wildlife that's there now.
Mhm.
I mean, and to Dan's point, I could pull out my phone now on my game camera from the last week. I've got bear, deer,
Yeah.
turkeys, everything, coyotes, that come, obviously interact with that field. Now, when you put a fence around that,
Yeah.
what is your take on now eliminating that for them to be able to
Yeah.
travel?
Yeah, well, I mean, I didn't mean to suggest that there are no impacts. Right. Especially to our common species. Like I said, there are some losers. There's some gainers and some losers. And bear, certainly, yeah, that's, to be excluded from that area. And of course, for the most part, when you take out the trees, there's not a lot left for bears to enjoy unless they're garbage piles someplace in the, you know what I mean? So you're effectively removing their habitat, which would otherwise be used, but now, because the habitat's different, they won't really want to use it, and they'll push off somewhere else, just like deer, moose, any of the, coyotes that can't get under the fence, although they probably will.
Put goats in there, they will.
Yeah, right. Absolutely.
Thank you.
So, so that's, All right, I'm gonna find my way home.
Yeah, so thank you very much.
Thank you, Rick.
Yes,
Well,
thank you.
And it was great to talk with you, even though there was no quorum. We didn't have to make really any decisions
Correct.
tonight anyway, so.
And we do have the recording, so this will, in theory, be live streaming, but we will also have the recording if it did not, so we can make sure that this is up on our website, just as all of our previous meetings have been. And thank you.
Yeah, and we'll just keep in touch when we see some new plans. We'll
Absolutely.
share them along. All right, good to meet you. Take care, everybody. Have a nice evening.
Bye-bye, Rick.
Thanks a
See
lot.
you Thursday, right? Thursday.
All right, so the next thing that we would normally be doing is setting our next meeting. Typically, that's the Thursday after the planning board. And so a suggestion that we might do is to set up a slightly easier, rather than the Tuesday after the planning board. A suggestion would be that we start making this be the last Tuesday of the month, just to make it easier for people's calendars. I don't want to make the decision here on that because we don't have several other members. So that will probably be a email based planning situation where either Russ or Dana will put together what everybody says is okay for them. But I wanted to try and get to a actual set meeting time for that, rather than let's just schedule the next meeting. And so that's kind of where I'm at with that. So please let
Stay
Russ
tuned.
and Dana know, stay
Yeah.
tuned. We'll have the mass mail go out that suggests that and lets people comment back to them. Other than that, since we can't do minutes as we are not a quorum, it would be public comment. And we've had public commenting the whole time, but if you have anything further, please let us know.
I'm all set, thank you.
All right. Well, then I would move that, well, I guess we're not really even moving. So I'm going to go ahead and close the meeting at 8:38.
All right.
Thank you all for coming.
Thank you, Dave.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Well,